Hi class, this is Introduction to Ethics, Module 1. So some of this is going to be a little repetitive and connected to the other videos posted for this learning module, but I just kind of want to have you hear my voice and talk you through a couple of ideas. So this front slide is just a reminder of where I'm located and how you can get a hold of me. Notice that this is already in the first overview of the learning module. At the beginning of every learning module, I list off the learning goals for that module. So our goals are moderated for each one of the learning modules. Some of the learning modules last a week, some last 2 weeks, just kind of depends. But right at the beginning, I want to make sure that everybody is clear on a couple of the categories studied within the discipline of philosophy, and then to offer some ideas about the key categories and fields of ethics that we're going to be looking at this semester. And then if you haven't already noticed, the big idea that runs throughout this course is that all of our discussions and writing assignments should be framed with the use of philosophical arguments. So we'll talk about the components of philosophical arguments. And of course, the other big idea is that you will practice constructing philosophical arguments related to ethics in your discussion post for Module 1. So you have the 3 boxes at the top: metaphysics, epistemology, and logic. These are 3 of the major disciplines of philosophy. And oftentimes in an introduction to philosophy class, you start by really talking about the difference between metaphysics and epistemology. So metaphysics looks at the questions related to being or existence. Questions like, what is truth? Why are we here? What does it mean to be human? So some of these questions about metaphysics are the big why questions, the big why and what questions of the universe. Whereas epistemology, which is about questions related to knowledge, so that's more the question of how. How do we know what we know? And I'll talk more about the divisions within metaphysics and epistemology, because it helps give you a little bit of a background on some of the different philosophers that we're going to be looking at this semester, so you get a little bit more of a historical background about the breakdown between metaphysics and epistemology. Logic is the discipline of logic, the study of logic, or a theory of correct reasoning. So this is implied we'll be covering logic in the sense that I'm wanting you to be practicing correct argument form, and also to be able to give each other feedback in your discussions about the strength of each other's arguments. So really pay attention to the structure of your arguments and the structure of your classmates' arguments. Now, the 4th major area of philosophy are all of the philosophical fields that study questions related to values. Why is it that so they're the things, what do we value? And moral philosophy and ethics, it really looks at questions of what is the right thing to do in any given situation. How does a person know what is the right thing to do? I noticed in some of your introductory posts, some of you said, do the right thing. That's an idea that you hold. Well, how do you know what is the right thing? So moral philosophy and the study of ethics attempts to answer those questions. perhaps establish some rules or guidelines. Social philosophy and political philosophy and aesthetics are other domains of philosophy that examine questions related to values, the values of the society, the values of the political governance structure of society, the value of beauty and art and music. So even though they're separate disciplines, actually you'll notice that we're kind of touching on a lot of these different disciplines of philosophy in this class. So sometimes people say there's 5 divisions or 6 divisions, and we're covering also contractualism in this class, or contract theory, which sometimes people lump in with political philosophy, but I think it's important to cover in this class as well. But 5 of the big branches of ethics or moral philosophy. The first one is divine command ethics. So the question is, how do we know what's the right thing to do? Well, God, or someone's God, ordains or tells us what to do. And you'll see that the Christian philosophers, Augustine and Aquinas, who lived at very different points in time, Augustine living in the 4th century, Aquinas living in the 14th century, had very different ideas, but both were attempting to answer the question of what does God demand? So consequentialism is another discipline or branch of ethics, and there's several different theorists who could be considered consequentialists. So look at the root of the word consequence. So consequentialist philosophers believe that you determine what is the right thing to do based on the action that has the best outcome. So the ends justify the means. Whatever happens at the end is a reason enough to decide to do something. So both Epicureans and Stoics and utilitarians fall into the consequentialist camp. Now, number 3 is often the most challenging for people to understand, and it is deontological ethics. And the idea here is people need to, the deontologist that we'll be reading, Immanuel Kant, asks the question, well, how do we know what is the right thing to do? Well, we know what's the right thing to do by creating a universal rule for determining what your moral duty is, so that there's something, the ends don't justify the means for deontologists. You have to look at what it is you're doing, and that has to be right in and of itself. So we'll be unpacking this later this semester. Number 4 is very interesting. So virtue ethics says, how do we know what is the right thing to do? Well, we know what's the right thing to do by emulating or imagining what does a virtuous person do. So some examples of virtue ethicists would be Plato, Aristotle, and Nietzsche. Confucius is also a virtue ethicist. So the 5th branch of ethics, which is really not very robust, and we won't spend a lot of time on it because it's kind of wishy-washy, and that's the branch of ethics called relativism, which basically says, well, my culture says this, so that's ethical for me because I live in this culture. So one culture can say, hey, female circumcision is just okay because that's what we've always done. Whereas another culture might say, no, female circumcision is bad, it has no health benefits, and all it does is deprive women of pleasure. So these are some of the big schools, and you can see that we're going to be looking at all of these branches of ethics at some point during the semester, in addition to the concept of contractualism. So, I have several other videos that may be more useful than my own video, but just to repeat again that an arguments must contain at least one premise and one conclusion. So the premise is the reason that supports the conclusion, and conclusion is the point or the big idea of the argument. So here's an example of a statement attributed to Winston Churchill. I am an optimist. It does not seem to be much use being anything else. So think for a minute, look at this. Which sentence is the premise and which is the conclusion? Have you decided? Is the premise the first statement and the conclusion the second statement? Or is the first statement the conclusion and the second statement the premise? Notice you might think that a premise always comes first, but that's not necessarily true. Sometimes people state their conclusion first and then tell you why they have that view. So if you haven't gotten it already, I am an optimist is Winston Churchill's conclusion. And then the second statement, it does not seem to be much use to being anything else, is his premise. So that implies certain things. So notice there's actually what's the opposite of being an optimist? A pessimist? What is not optimistic? So he has an unstated premise, which is that being a pessimist is not useful, right? That's implied by the premise of the second statement, but not specifically identified. But you can, once you start looking at an argument, you have to look at not just what's there in front of you, but anything that is being implied or asserted without being stated. So that's kind of a nice straightforward one. Here's another one. Okay, this is from a Sherlock Holmes book written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A dog was kept in the stables, and yet, though someone had been in and, I should have wrote and, fetched out a horse, the dog had not barked. Obviously, the visitor was someone whom the dog knew well. So remember, Sherlock Holmes is our primary example of someone who practices deductive logic. So, what's the conclusion? Have you decided? What are the premises? Or is there only one? So the conclusion here is obviously the visitor was someone whom the dog knew well. So now this is a case of, right, the sleuth figuring out the answer to the crime, right? So what are the reasons to support Sherlock's conclusion? So the first premise was a dog was kept in the stables, right? And it says, and yet though someone had been in and fetched out a horse, the dog had not barked. So there's actually a second unstated premise, which is dogs bark at people they don't know, right? So if the dog hadn't barked, the person who came in had to be not a stranger, okay? So So notice this argument, it suggests some things for us to think about that aren't actually in the statement. So here's an example of someone who builds an argument and tries to effectively link premises and reasons to the eventual conclusion. So this is a famous philosopher, Bertrand Russell, who wrote, "The evils of the world are due to moral defects quite as much as to lack of intelligence. But the human race has not hitherto discovered any method of eradicating moral defects. Intelligence, on the contrary, is easily improved by methods known to every competent educator. Therefore, until some method of teaching virtue has been discovered, progress will have to be sought by improvement of intelligence rather than morals." So what's the conclusion? How do we know what the conclusion is? Well, there happens to be a nice, what's called a conclusion indicator in this example here, and that's the word therefore. So notice Bertrand Russell goes through to make an assertion about the evils of the world, and then some facts about his assertion about whether or not people can get rid of moral defects, right? So now, where would this argument fall apart? What would have to happen to make this argument fall apart? Would you have to disagree with the conclusion or disagree with one of the premises? Where do you think it is that arguments fall apart? So what I want you to be doing, there's no one right answer to this, but what I want you to be noticing in each other as well as your own self is when you're making a statement, right? A really strong argument will be supported. And we can actually see here that Bertrand Russell supports his argument. His first assertion is that there's problems in the world which are due for two reasons: moral defects and lack of intelligence, right? So if you want to get rid of evil, right, it's implied you would get rid of moral defects and lack of intelligence. But he's saying there isn't any surefire way of eradicating moral defects, so might as well improve intelligence, right? So he lays that out step by step. So it is an effective argument because it flows and it kind of sequences ideas together. Now, notice we can make an argument about almost anything. Now, I put this at the opening, as the opening image of this class. I mean, I kind of did it for fun because I think it's sort of silly. Like, what does it mean, do not feed a mythical creature, right? Now, I took this picture, just so you know the context, I took this picture at the generator in Sparks, which is where they build a lot of art for Burning Man. And a couple of years ago, I was there with a friend touring the generator, and I took a picture of this, and I just thought it was so funny. But notice that anytime we see a visual, we actually also have an implication of an argument. So what's the implied argument here? What's the conclusion? Don't feed the unicorn. But why should you not feed the unicorn? What's implied? The unicorn is bloodthirsty, right? So almost anything you can create an argument off an image with words, off a concept. So I want you to, this is the practice of this course, will be strengthening your ability to make, identify, and evaluate arguments. So I just have a couple of ideas for all of you as you're thinking about how to create your own ethical arguments. So as you're going through and kind of brainstorming your ideas for future discussion posts and future papers, write down everything that you can think about your point. I mean, some of you in your and I know it was supposed to be off the top of your head, off the cuff, things about what you think are ethical behaviors. But think about whether or not you're really saying something. So when I hear someone say, do the right thing, I actually have no idea what that means. I don't know what that person's point of view is. I really don't know what the idea is. What does it mean to do the right thing? It, you know, so how say more about that. So whatever it is that you're saying, go a little deeper and say, could somebody else who doesn't know me understand what I'm trying to say? And what reasons support your view? Do you have a point? What lens or flavor is your point of view? I mean, honestly, I'm a 52-year-old woman. So a lot of my viewpoints, I can't all of a sudden become an 18-year-old boy. So my point of view will always be lacking some level of lived experience that somebody who is an 18-year-old young man might have that I don't have. And I never had, right? Think about, here's another point of view that I have. I happen to be almost legally blind. I mean, I'm not blind, I wear glasses, but I have actually quite a bit of difficulty seeing without my glasses. So it's kind of weird, but like I wake up in the morning and the first thing I do is put my glasses on because it's actually pretty weird to just see blobs all the time. So my perspective on the world is actually shaped by my poor vision. Now, I could also say what my point of view, a lot of my point of view is also shaped by my parents and how I was raised. You know, I had weird intellectual parents who were like doing experiments on me, which I thought was kind of fun, actually. So really explore your point of view. And why do you have that point of view? Why do you have that point of view? Is it your life experience? Is it your age? Is it just why? Why do you think that way? What are the implications of your argument? So notice to press a little deeper. If I say something like, do the right thing. Okay, well, first, does that mean, well, first I have to define what is the right thing, right? And then if I have one view of what's right, let's say that I believe that paying my taxes is the right thing to do. And my neighbor thinks that not paying her taxes is the right thing to do. Do I have an implied view that doing the right thing would mean that my neighbor is wrong, right? So you have to think about whether, and I actually don't want you to create arguments that are just about you, me, myself, and I, because that's actually pretty useless. But ask yourself, does your view apply to all humans? Why or why not? Or does it only apply to people who look exactly like you? I can only create ethical statements for 52-year-old women who wear glasses. Does your view include non-humans? What are the implications for the other beings or rock formations, right? To the ethical statements that you're making. So the idea of this class is we're going to start at one level and keep digging and keep expanding so we can look at all the implications and permutations of our ethical ideas. And finally, the theme of the first discussion post, which is exploring eudaimonia, which is a word in Greek which often is associated with happiness, but it can also be interpreted as what brings fullness or completeness to a person's life, which is different than just some kind of superficial level of happiness. So in this sense, happiness, it's not just being in a good mood, it's something more. So really think about what material, what substance, a part of nature, emotional experience, relationship, or some other set of experiences. What is it that brings happiness and fullness? And I'll leave you with some beautiful fuchsia flowers that I saw in Maui. And what purpose do these flowers have? What purpose do they bring to your life just by looking at them right now?